They would only stick around to win the battle if they were certain they could win it. As the months went by, George Washington and the colonials got more troops and they became more skilled in their tactics and in winning battles.
On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read all across the new nation. People were celebrating and having fun. But soon, Britain attacked with full force.
They attacked at New York, and they drove Washington and his forces into New Jersey. I don't think people know how close we were to losing this war. The British were taking over the colonies, and Washington was low on supplies and food, and morale was low among his troops. And I think Billy Lee saw this. He probably feared for the end of the war, but even greater, he feared that he and Washington's dream of a free country may die. Despite this, he and Washington continued to rally even though they were forced into Pennsylvania across the Delaware.
Many of the men's enlistment was about to be up. They could go home soon and get away from this terrible war. The British were closing in on the position, and George didn't know what to do, except he knew if he wanted to win this war, he had to do something drastic and something fast.
Now, my great-great-great-granddad in Washington had been camping out in Pennsylvania down by the Delaware. One night, when the spies came back, they told him that the Hessians were in town. George said something like, "Well, they will have fun on their Christmas Eve, won't they?" Billy got an idea. He said, "Why don't we surprise them at Christmas?" George said, "How do you mean?" Billy said, "Well, if we marched out across the Delaware, we'd be 9 miles from the town in the forest. From there, we could walk into the town undetected and attack the Hessians." George stood up and ordered the troops to move out.
They acquired some boats and crossed the icy cold Delaware River. They marched to the town of Trenton and attacked the Hessians and won the battle, all thanks to Billy Lee. Now, after the battle, they had ammo, food, and cannons. They were no longer a staggering army. They were a force to be reckoned with. They were ready to fight for freedom.
As the war began to heat up, the colonialists had victory in their sights. Billy Lee joined Washington on the front lines and began to take on the redcoats, firing muskets and dodging bullets. Billy Lee served as Washington's personal bodyguard. Once a redcoat had Washington in his sights. Billy Lee saw this and dodged in front of the redcoat, but the redcoat refused to fire because he didn't want to waste a bullet on a black slave.
What would you do if you saw a gun pointed at the man who raised you, cared for you, and taught you everything you know? Billy wasn't about to lose his best friend. He would take a bullet for him. After this heroic act, Billy grew increasingly worried for George Washington and stayed extremely close to him.
There became a turning point for the colonials during the war. Although they were going up against the biggest and best army in the world, they were winning. As they waited for the French allies to show up, they chased the British into Virginia, and George Washington and his men, joined by other colonial armies, surrounded the British at Yorktown, Virginia, in October of 1778. When the French Navy arrived, they surrounded and trapped the British, forcing them to surrender.
The war is over. America won, and Washington turns to Billy and says, "We can go home now, William." People began to discuss, what do we do now? How do we start this new country? George sat in on a few meetings, but didn't sit long. He and Billy wanted to go home and rest. But George was still a general for the army. At present, he didn't have any duties, but he couldn't just up and leave.
So William asked George when they can leave and go back to Mount Vernon. George says, "I don't know. If I wasn't general anymore, I could do this." So Billy asked him, "Why don't you relinquish your rank? It will show people what a great man you are." So George did this.
Now he was known for that because of his place during the war. Washington became the most famous person in the new America, and he held lots of parties at Mount Vernon. People wanted to meet him, and sometimes people would show up unannounced. Billy Lee would have to ask them to leave. It was almost like today's paparazzi. Washington was quoted as saying, "I couldn't do it if it weren't for Billy Lee." Quote.
Then one day while Billy was on a trip to Washington in 1785, he fell and broke his kneecap. Then, while he and Washington were drunk one night, he fell again and broke his other kneecap. But this didn't stop him from finding a wife. Margaret was a freed slave, and she worked in Washington's headquarters during the war. She and Billy fell in love, but slave marriages weren't recognized in Virginia law. So in 1784, Washington had Margaret move down to Mount Vernon, and there Billy and she were allowed to live in the same house.
With a new, stronger government being formed, the delegates could not decide how they were going to do it. But they saw how Washington gave up his command. And they decided, along with Washington, that he should be the new president of the United States. So in April of 1789, the delegates voted George Washington the new president of the United States.
George rode from Mount Vernon to the Capitol in New York City. There they had the inauguration and ceremony for the first president. Now, due to Billy breaking both of his kneecaps, he couldn't make it to the inauguration. He tried, but pain got the better of him.
He had doctors make a metal brace for his leg so he could walk. He didn't help George Washington in his presidency, but chose to stay at Mount Vernon with his wife, making shoes. He said good friends from the war would stop by and they would talk. Then one day, his best friend, George Washington, died. He died December 14, 1799, and Billy was at his side.
In Washington's will, Billy Lee was freed and inherited money. He was also given the option of living out his life in Mount Vernon, which he chose to do with his wife Margaret. They had one son together who carried on the Lee family name. In December of 1828, Billy passed away due to alcoholism. He was 78 years old.
Most of the information we have of him today is based on folklore and passed on stories. Most of it has been proven, but some we may never know. I wish I'd met him. He was a great man. I wonder what he'd think of today. He'd be happy we don't treat blacks the way we used to. Our president would probably shock him. But thanks to him, every man, person, or race can be president, and people are treated equal and fair.
Without Billy Lee, I don't think people back then could see slaves as anything else. He really showed people that African Americans were people just like any of the colonial Americans. He helped our founding father to victory and led the way for other blacks to rise up and be free.
At Mount Vernon, Billy Lee is buried, and a plaque by a flagpole says, quote, "In memory of the Afro-Americans who served as slaves at Mount Vernon. This monument marking their burial ground dedicated September 21st, 1983. That's where some say Billy Lee is exactly buried, but we'll never know for sure. The fact is that the country would be nothing without him. This is a man forgotten in history. Maybe if he was white, he would have had more fame. Another unknown fact is that Billy Lee helped Washington so much, some say that what made Washington look weak. Of course it doesn't make Washington look weak, because an honorable man doesn't look at skin color, just another human being with great character traits. Now the story of Billy Lee has been told. Maybe history can be rewritten for the common equality of all men.